0. At November's Miami Book Fair, author Dava Sobell discussed her book, Galileo's Daughter, a historical memoir of science, faith, and love. It's the story of Maria Celeste, the illegitimate daughter of scientist Galileo Galilei. It's currently #1 on the New York Times paperback nonfiction bestseller list. This event is about 50 minutes.
Good afternoon. Dava Sobell has become one of the most prominent historians in this country of science and technology. I'm sure many of you have read her previous book, Longitude, and many of you may well have gotten Galileo's Daughter, her current book. Ms. Sobell has a unique ability to, let's say, triangulate her science and technology narratives. Not only does she wed the narrative to the times in which the person lived, both political and economic, and effectively the development of that civilization, but she brings a unique personal perspective to the story she's told. John Harrison in Longitude has to struggle against many entrenched interests in the scientific community in Britain, and Galileo takes on none other than the Pope, who is using the entire affair as a political gambit to reaffirm his own faith. In addition, the current book brings a special perspective with Galileo's daughter and the life she led as a cloistered nun. So in one very enjoyable, very interesting and stimulating narrative, one gets a fascinating view of Italy during the Baroque era, not to mention many wonderful and interesting people. Here is Dava Sobell.
Can I make this a little? Hello. I'm going to see if I'm always the shortest person on the program. Here we go. Okay. Well, I was going to read to you, I would like to read a little. Is that okay? I think that's usually what happens here. And I was going to read you the chapter about the plague, because plague has been in the news lately. But given that we are in Miami in the never-ending election, I thought I might read the chapter about the election of the new Pope. All right? Just to go with the current climate here. This is chapter 9. I guess I should say a couple of introductory things. This book did grow directly out of Longitude, although it's a lot bigger than Longitude, so it grew from it and then overgrew it. And the reason is that Galileo had tried to solve the longitude problem, and I was reading a lot about his work in that direction. And in fact, an entire book was written about Galileo's efforts on longitude. And the book contained a fragment of a letter to Galileo from his daughter, which was about the most startling thing I ever discovered, because I never knew he had children. Did you know he had children? He's a marble bust, right? So, and then the daughter was a nun, so that was even more shocking still, because Galileo is supposed to be the great enemy of the Catholic Church, and here is this devoted daughter writing an intimate letter, and I thought, there's no way these two people could be that far apart on something as important as religious conviction. So maybe everything I ever learned about Galileo was wrong, and that in fact turned out to be true. The daughter kept up a lifelong correspondence with him, and 124 of her letters still survive because he saved them. And the problem was they had never been published in any language other than their original Italian. So luckily for me, I had studied Italian in college for no good reason at the time, but I guess all along it was pointing me toward this wonderful project, which I have enjoyed thoroughly. So that was how the book began. And this chapter, which is called How Our Father is Favored, begins with one of these letters from Galileo's oldest child. He had 3 illegitimate children, all with the same lover. And the oldest was his favorite, and for obvious reasons. Most illustrious Lord Father, the happiness I derived from the gift of the letters you sent me, sire, written to you by that most distinguished cardinal, now elevated to the exalted position of Supreme Pontiff, was ineffable, for his letters so clearly express the affection this great man has for you, and also show how highly he values your abilities. I have read and reread them, savoring them in private, and I return them to you, as you insist, without having shown them to anyone else except Suor Arcangela, who has joined me in drawing the utmost joy from seeing how much our Father is favored by persons of such caliber. May it please the Lord to grant you the robust health you will need to fulfill your desire to visit His Holiness, so that you can be even more greatly esteemed by Him. And seeing how many promises He makes in His letters, we can entertain the hope that the Pope will readily grant you some sort of assistance for our brother. In the meantime, we shall not fail to pray the Lord, from whom all grace descends, to bless you by letting you achieve all that you desire, so long as that be for the best. I can only imagine, sire, what a magnificent letter you must have written to His Holiness to congratulate him on the occasion of his reaching this exalted rank. And because I am more than a little bit curious, I yearn to see a copy of that letter, if it would please you to show it. And I thank you so much for the ones you have already sent, as well as for the melons, which we enjoyed most gratefully. I have dashed off this note in considerable haste, so I beg your pardon if I have for that reason been sloppy or spoken amiss. I send you loving greetings, along with the others here who always ask to be remembered to you. From San Mateo, the 10th day of August, most affectionate daughter, Suor Maria Celeste. Only 4 days previously, on August 6th, 1623, Maffeo Cardinal Barberini stood sweating in the Sistine Chapel, where he and more than 50 fellow cardinals had been locked together since mid-July in papal election proceedings. Absent the unified conviction inspired by the Holy Spirit that had led to the acclamatio selection of Gregory XV 2 years before, the Sacred College of Cardinals now prayed for guidance in the balloting. The members voted twice a day, morning and afternoon, each one prohibited from endorsing himself, and all of them disguising their handwriting to maintain the secrecy of the selection process. Every time the tabulation failed to produce the required 2/3 majority, the cardinal scrutineers bound the slips of paper and burned them in a special stove with wet straw, which sent up the black smoke of indecision. The typical heat and malaria that visited Rome every summer claimed the lives of 6 elderly cardinals in the conclave before the assembly at last cast 50 of its 55 ballots for Barberini as the new leader of the church. "Do you, most reverend Lord Cardinal," the Chamberlain asked him face to face, "accept your election as Supreme Pontiff, which has been canonically carried out?" "Accepto," he answered, with the only word required. "By what name will you be known?" The choices included his own Christian name, Maffeo, or the name of any pope who had preceded him, except Peter, of course, which tradition forbade. At a stroke, Maffeo Barberini metamorphosed into Pope Urban VIII. The ballots, burned with dry straw instead of wet this time, announced their white smoke signal to the crowds around the Vatican, and soon the declaration, "We have a pope," justified the crescendoing ecstasy of their cries. Galileo, recognizing the potential personal boon of this turn of events, shared his excitement with Suor Maria Celeste, by sending her a sheaf of letters that spanned a decade of pleasant exchanges. These dated from Cardinal Barberini's first letter to Galileo in 1611, when he called him a virtuous and pious man of great value, whose longevity could only improve the lives of others. The passing years had fanned the cardinal's ardor, so that his 1620 poem, Dangerous Adulation, not only cited Galileo as the discoverer of wondrous new celestial phenomena, but also used his sunspots as a metaphor for dark fears in the hearts of the mighty. In closing the cover letter to Galileo that accompanied this poetic tribute, the cardinal had signed himself with noteworthy warmth as your brother. Galileo naturally took a more deferential tone in his responses, noting sentiments such as, "I am your humble servant, reverently kissing your hem and praying God that the greatest felicity shall be yours." He wrote as often as necessary to keep Cardinal Barberini updated on his scientific work, and sent him a copy of each of his books, as well as his unpublished treatise on the tides and Guiducci's discourse on the comets. The most recent letter from the cardinal bore the date June 24th, 1623, just weeks prior to his accession, in which he thanked Galileo for guiding a favorite nephew, Francesco Barberini, through the successful completion of doctoral studies at Pisa. Galileo wanted nothing so much as to travel to Rome in August, to kiss the feet of the new pope, and march with his fellow Lincean academicians in Urban's investiture procession. The exciting early days of the Barberini pontificate overflowed with promise for all artists and scientists, and particularly those from Urban's native Florence. Striking now, Galileo thought he might well secure the Pope's blessing for his own most sensitive projects, and at the same time ensure his son's future. Galileo had sent Vincenzio off to law school at the University of Pisa the previous year. Now he hoped to obtain a pension for him, a title as a canon that would guarantee Vincenzio a small annual base income for the rest of his life in exchange for little or no real work. Such sinecures influenced the economy of 17th century Italy, often draining the revenues of small dioceses while filling the pockets of absentee landlords, at least half of whom were laymen. Despite the abuses of this system, however, Rome not only tolerated it, but also supervised it, because the pensions supported so many more prelates than the papal treasury could afford to pay. As for Suor Maria Celeste's request to see a copy of her father's congratulatory letter to Urban, Galileo denied it on the grounds that he had not written one. He explained to her that although he enjoyed a most cordial relationship of long standing with His Holiness, enabling him to dedicate his new book to the Pope and confidently anticipate a private audience at the Vatican, protocol argued against a personal note on this occasion. Instead, he had proffered his congratulations through the proper channel of Urban's nephew Francesco, who had been Galileo's student. "It was through your most gentle and loving letter," Suor Maria Celeste confessed a few days later, "that I became fully aware of my backwardness in assuming as I did that you, sire, would perforce write right away to such a person, or to put it better, to the loftiest Lord in all the world. Therefore I thank you for pointing out my error, and at the same time I feel certain that you will, by the love you bear me, excuse my gross ignorance and as many other flaws as find expression in my character. I readily concede that you are the one to correct and advise me in all matters, just as I desire you to do, and would so appreciate your doing, for I realize how little knowledge and ability I can justly call my own." The date of this letter, August 13th, marked Suor Maria Celeste's 23rd birthday, although she made no reference to that fact. She reckoned the accumulation of her years now by the anniversary of her nun's vows on October 4th, and by the feast day of the Holy Virgin Mary, whose name she had taken, on September 8th. Within a week, she learned that illness had scotched Galileo's travel plans and forced him into Florence to the home of his late sister, where his recently widowed brother-in-law and his nephew were taking care of him. The news arrived via the steward of San Matteo, a hired man who lived on the convent grounds with his wife, helping the nuns by tending to the heavy work and the traffic with the outside world. "This morning I learned from our steward that you find yourself ill in Florence, sire," she wrote on August 17th. "And because it sounds to me like something outside your normal behavior to leave home when you are troubled by your pains, I am filled with apprehension and fear that you are in much worse condition than usual. Therefore I beseech you to give the steward some account of your state, so that, if you do not fare as badly as we fear, we can calm our anxious spirits. And truly I never resent living cloistered as a nun, except when I hear that you are sick, because then I would like to be free to come to visit and care for you with all the diligence I could muster. But even though I cannot, I thank the Lord God for everything, knowing full well that not a leaf turns without his willing it so." Pope Urban VIII suddenly took sick too. He contracted the fever that ran epidemic through Rome that summer of 1623 and was compelled to postpone his coronation until late September. Even without the official ceremony, Urban had commenced the exercise of his new powers immediately upon accepting the vote of the conclave, as was his right. On the very day of his election, August 6th, he issued the bulls of canonization that made saints of Ignatius Loyola and Francis Xavier, the Jesuit founders, and also Filippo Neri, the Apostle of Rome. Within weeks, Urban VIII began appointing his brothers and nephews to potent positions in the new regime, inviting detractors to quip that the 3 B's on the family escutcheon had led former lives as horseflies. The opportunistic Barberini, after all, laid no prior claim to nobility or wealth. Nevertheless, the Barberini Pope now commanded the respect of all Christian princes and princes of the Church. Urban turned his married brother, Carlo, into commander-in-chief of the papal armies and made a cardinal of Carlo's erudite eldest son, Francesco. On September 29th, the day of Urban's coronation, the new pope is said to have displayed the dramatic devotional style that characterized his memorable 20-year tenure. As he prepared to receive the white papal robes and the velvet shoes of the fisherman, he threw himself before the altar in the Chapel of Tears. Prostrate, he prayed for death to take him the moment his pontificate veered from the good of the Church. If such a thing should ever happen, God forbid. Then Urban consented to be carried in the silk-upholstered sedia gestatoria, the capacious portable throne flanked by ostrich feather fans, into St. Peter's Basilica, where the Sacred College of Cardinals installed him according to the ancient ceremony. "Receive this tiara adorned with 3 crowns. Know that thou art the father of princes and kings, victor of the whole world under the earth, the vicar of our Lord Jesus Christ, to whom be the glory and honor without end." Compared with the elderly Paul and the sickly Gregory of recent memory, the 55-year-old Urban cut a youthful, almost military figure, especially when seen riding on horseback through the Vatican gardens. If the Pope resembled a general, he showed he could strategize like one too. Indeed, history provoked him to use this talent repeatedly over the next 2 decades in the waging of wars for the defense of the Italian peninsula and the integrity of the Papal States. Urban would also battle the Protestant Reformation, which still continued to erode the power of the Roman Church, by stepping up Catholic reform measures in his own style. He foresaw improved ecclesiastical education and networks of foreign missions radiating from a Roman base. "This is a city upon a hill," Urban pronounced in announcing a thorough investigation of Rome's own religious health, "which is exposed for the whole world to gaze upon." Urban intended also to gild and glorify the physical beauty of the Holy See with new building projects and monuments. Their construction would employ armies of architects, sculptors, and painters, and invent Urban's reputation as a great patron of the arts. Upon hearing that a group of admirers had expressed the wish to commission a monument in the Pope's honor during his lifetime, instead of after his death, as was customary, Urban affirmed, "Let them. I am not an ordinary Pope either." As bookish as he was bold, Urban peopled his curia with literati. He chose for his master of pontifical ceremonies Monsignor Virginio Cesarini, Lincean, who wrote acclaimed poetry and had pursued the study of mathematics after hearing an inspirational lecture by Galileo. It was from Cesarini that Galileo had received observations of the 1618 comets, and to Cesarini that Galileo addressed his ultimate reply to the Jesuit Father Grassi in The Assayer. Immediately upon this book's long-awaited publication in Rome in late October 1623, Cesarini began reading it aloud to Urban at mealtimes. Urban, who had studied under the Jesuits at the Collegio Romano, could not help admiring the style with which Galileo skewered his opponent on his similes. "I believe that good philosophers fly alone, like eagles," Galileo said in The Assayer, "and not in flocks, like starlings. It is true that because eagles are rare birds, they are little seen and less heard, while birds that fly like starlings fill the sky with shrieks and cries, and wherever they settle, befoul the earth beneath them." Charmed, Urban declared himself all eagerness for Galileo to come to see him. But the great Florentine philosopher remained ill through the autumn, and in the winter, the harsh weather restrained him. While Urban awaited Galileo's arrival, he continued to have Galileo's words read aloud at table. "The crowd of fools who know nothing is infinite. Those who know very little of philosophy are numerous. Few indeed are they who really know some part of it, and only one knows all." Pope Urban found his favorite passage from the Assayer in Galileo's parable about the song of the cicada, which demonstrated the boundless creativity of God in the bounty of nature. "Once upon a time, in a very lonely place," the story began, "there lived a man endowed by nature with extraordinary curiosity and a very penetrating mind. For a pastime he raised birds, whose songs he much enjoyed, and he observed with great admiration the happy contrivance by which they could transform at will the very air they breathed into a variety of sweet songs. One night this man chanced to hear a delicate song close to his house, and being unable to connect it with anything but some small bird, he set out to capture it. When he arrived at a road, he found a shepherd boy who was blowing into a kind of hollow stick while moving his fingers about on the wood, thus drawing from it a variety of notes similar to those of a bird, though by quite a different method. Puzzled, but impelled by his natural curiosity, he gave the boy a calf in exchange for this flute and returned to solitude. But realizing that if he had not chanced to meet the boy, he would never have learned of the existence of a new method of forming musical notes and the sweetest songs, he decided to travel to distant places in the hope of meeting with some new adventure. As the man roved, he encountered songs made by a bow sawing upon some fibers stretched over a hollow piece of wood, by the hinges of a temple gate, by a man rubbing his fingertip around the rim of a goblet, and by the beating wings of wasps. And as his wonder grew, his conviction proportionately diminished that he knew how sounds were produced. Nor would all his previous experiences have sufficed to teach him or even allow him to believe that crickets derive their sweet and sonorous shrilling by scraping their wings together, particularly as they cannot fly at all. Well, after this man had come to believe that no more ways of forming tones could possibly exist, he suddenly found himself once more plunged deeper into ignorance and bafflement than ever. For having captured in his hands a cicada, he failed to diminish its strident noise either by closing its mouth or stopping its wings. Yet he could not see it move the scales that covered its body or any other thing. At last, he lifted up the armor of its chest, and there he saw some thin, hard ligaments beneath. Thinking the sound might come from their vibration, he decided to break them in order to silence it. But nothing happened until his needle drove too deep, and transfixing the creature, he took away its life with its voice, so that he was still unable to determine whether the song had originated in those ligaments. And by this experience, his knowledge was reduced to diffidence, so that when asked how sounds were created, he used to answer tolerantly that, although he knew a few ways, he was sure that many more existed which were not only unknown, but unimaginable. This section of the Assayer delighted Urban with its graceful language and poetic conceit, and even more because it expressed his own philosophy of science. To wit, as earnestly as men may seek to understand the workings of the universe, they must remember that God is not hampered by their limited logic, that all observed effects may have been wrought by him in any one of an infinite number of omnipotent ways, and these must ever evade mortal comprehension. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? We need a brave soul to go first, right here. Why did I write this book? Well, as it did grow out of Longitude, but I think probably what got me about it was more an emotional reaction. And I didn't remember this at the time when I read that first piece of one of the daughter's letters. It was about a year into the project that I suddenly remembered that when my father died, and I had helped my mother go through his clothing and give things away, I wanted something small of his that I could just keep. And so I was looking through his drawers, trying to find that. And in the top drawer, the only thing that wasn't socks or underwear was a letter from me that I had written him 20 years previously, and that he had saved all that time. So yeah, everybody has a reason for picking a story, and probably that was mine. And I had been interested in Galileo anyway as a charismatic figure. I mean, there's a vast underground network of people who really love Galileo. This book was the opposite problem from Longitude because nobody had ever heard of John Harrison, whereas everybody has heard of Galileo, and everybody knows something about him and knows it with a passionate conviction. And a lot of those things are wrong. So I was very anxious while writing not to write in an offensive way or to be sensitive to people's feelings about Galileo, because Galileo does elicit an emotional response from people. There is a Galileo scholar who actually started out as a stockbroker and got so interested in Galileo that he learned Italian to be able to read Galileo in the original, and then did definitive English translations of all of Galileo's works. So he really gets things from people. Yes, I will either you step to the microphone or I will repeat the question. How's that? And then we don't have to have a lot of climbing over people. Who is the next? Yes, ma'am. question is to talk a little bit more about the research, because although there are biographies of Galileo, there's not much known about the private life beyond these letters. Well, these letters are a tremendous resource. And actually, Galileo's own correspondence provides great detail about much in his private life. Although his letters to his daughter do not survive, about 2,000 of his letters to contemporaries are still in publication with the rest of his complete works. So there really is a lot known about him. And as you mentioned, there's no shortage of books about Galileo. But what struck me as really important about the daughter was not just her existence. I mean, I didn't want to write a feminist tract, what kind of astrophysicist might she have been if she hadn't been cloistered in 17th century Italy? That's not the point. She lived in that country at that time, and it was important to tell the story as it was. But it was her suggestion of his religious faith that really got me started. And then there is ample evidence in Galileo's own writings of how he felt about these things. Galileo believed that the Bible was the true dictated word of God, but that the Bible was not supposed to teach you astronomy. In fact, there's hardly any mention of even the names of the planets in the Bible. And to learn about science, you were supposed to consult the book of nature. He had a wonderful way of phrasing this. He said, the Bible is a book about how to go to heaven, not how heaven goes. So in his mind, once you really understood the deep significance of the Bible, and much of it was written allegorically, it required serious thought and interpretation, and you compare that with an appropriately deep level of understanding of science, there could be no contradiction. It would all be one truth. So my image of Galileo, which I think most people who came up through American public school system would share, that he was the person who drew the dividing line between science and religion with his cool head and brilliant mind, put all that stuff behind him and just pursued science. No. He stayed a good Catholic, and he was the father of modern physics at the same time. And I think that's a very important perspective. Other questions? We have a strict law to enforce here. The microphone. Who is near the microphone? Who has a question? Yes, sir.
Could you go into a little bit about why he chose not to marry the mother of this woman, and how his 3 children responded to that, and what that did to his relationship with the church?
I want to make sure I understood the question. Why he chose not to marry the mother of his children, what effect that had on the children, and how did that affect his relationship with the church?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, this is actually the question I'm asked most often, even at physics and astronomy colloquia. Why didn't Galileo marry Marina Gamba? And to be fair, only he and she know for sure. But it seems clear that the real reason is she was not of his social station. He was of patrician birth, not wealthy, but of a family that had been active in the government, and he was really a somebody. She was a nobody. And that is clear from the baptismal records of the children. She is described as Marina of Venice, and later Marina, daughter of Andrea Gamba. But who is he? Also, she's Marina of Venice, and he, Galileo, is from Tuscany, with great designs on a court position in Tuscany. And of course, we all think of Italy as being a country, but in the 17th century, it was not a country. It was a group of separate states, duchies, kingdoms, and they were on that peninsula, so they sort of spoke the same language, but that was the end of the togetherness. And a Venetian wife at the Tuscan court would not have gone over well. Also, as a scholar, he was not expected to marry, nor was he expected to remain celibate. And nobody really raised much fuss about the 3 illegitimate children. Didn't make him less of a good Catholic. In fact, the Medici family had lots of illegitimate children. One of those became a pope. And there were popes who had illegitimate children. So it was a different time. And, or maybe not. And for all the trouble Galileo got in, and he was in trouble most of his life, nobody ever gave him grief about the illegitimate children. And he took care of them for the rest of his life. In fact, when he moved to Tuscany, he took the children. He didn't take her, but he took them. And the effect on them was that the girls had poor marital prospects, which is part of the reason he put them in a convent. But even this should not be viewed as cruel and unusual punishment, because in Italy in the 17th century, most young women entered the convent. Dowries were expensive, and if even in a family where there were, say, 2 or 3 legitimately born girls, the prettiest one would get married, and the others would enter the convent. And about half the young women in Florence were in convents, 3/4 in Milan. Not that they were any more religious in Milan, it's just the way it tended to work out. And I think that if his life had been different, I think he might well have found dowries for, when he put them in, they were 12 and 13, so they couldn't take vows then. And it was not clear that he wanted them to stay there forever. Usually you put the young girls in the convent to be educated and to make sure they remain virgins, although it was no guarantee. And then at 16 they could take their vows, or they could come out and get married. And had his life not been in such turmoil then, he might well have found husbands for them. The dowry would have been a problem, because by then he was also taking care not only of his 2 sisters' dowries, but his brother and the brother's 8 children. So he was spread thin. Okay? Okay. Another question. Somebody is, while she makes her way to the microphone, the question up front was, what's next? So I'll tell you, the next is a book about the planets of the solar system. Yes.
If you don't mind answering a question about longitude.
I'd be delighted.
A wonderful book.
Thank you.
I was fascinated by the character of that cranky watchmaker, John Harrison, who waited so long for the prize.
Yes.
For his invention. What happened to the family afterward? I mean, did anyone enjoy that money?
Well, you heard the question. I don't have to repeat it. Yes, they did enjoy the money. Harrison's son, Harrison died 3 years after he got the money, so he didn't have a lot of chance to enjoy it. But the son inherited it and went on to be a doer of good deeds. So it seems that the money found good use. Anyone else? All right. Thank you.
Dava Sobell is the author of Galileo's Daughter, a historical memoir of science, faith, and love. It's the story of Maria Celeste, the illegitimate daughter of scientist Galileo Galilei. It's currently available in paperback by Penguin USA, and it tops the New York Times paperback nonfiction bestseller list. For more information, visit their website at penguinputnam.com.